Welcome. In today's episode, we will talk about moments where tourist attractions became a deadly interaction between tourists and animals. From a woman who got in the path of an elephant in Must to a man who fell into an enclosure. But first, let us start with the first story where a couple became a fatality on their vacation. It was September 6th, 2016, and the Pacific off Baja California was building into the kind of swell that makes small operations question their schedules, gray, cold, and indifferent to whatever had been planned. Guadalupe Island sits roughly 160 miles offshore, a remote formation rising from one of the most shark-dense stretches of the northeastern Pacific. People book trips there, specifically because the water is full of things that could kill them. Thomas Carter was 54 years old. He ran a roofing company out of Phoenix, built over decades through early mornings, contracted bids, and a reliable client base accumulated slowly and deliberately. His wife Julia was 52, a real estate broker who had worked the Phoenix market long enough to understand the difference between what a property was worth and what someone would pay for it. They had been married for 27 years. For their anniversary, Julia, who had spent years watching great white shark documentaries and developed the kind of sustained interest that eventually becomes a plan, booked a shark cage diving excursion through a small operator running trips out of the island's anchorage. The outfit was newer to Guadalupe's waters than the established operations that had worked the site for years. It ran a smaller vessel, booked guests directly, and by 2016 was not operating in full compliance with the safety protocols that Mexican maritime authorities and longer established operators had developed through accumulated experience. That distinction was not visible in the booking process. It showed up in the equipment. The cage, a steel frame structure suspended from the vessel's side by a lift cable, with a hinged entry gate secured by a single latch mechanism, was deployed into water where sharks had already been active. Several large great whites circled the bait line, closer and more aggressive than the crew had accounted for in their briefing. I want to pause on that latch. A gate held shut by one mechanism rated for the calm nudge of curiosity rather than the full-body impact of an animal that can weigh over 2,000 pounds is not a safety feature. It's a formality that happens to work most of the time. One of the great whites, drawn by the bait line strung close to the cage, misjudged its approach or committed to it deliberately. Investigators would later disagree on which and struck the cage at full speed. The impact sheared the latch and forced the gate inward. Before the crew above could react, a second shark, drawn by the disturbance, pushed through the same breach. Inside a structure built for two people in open water, there was suddenly no open water at all. The second shark's first pass caught Julia, and the bite, glancing but severe, was enough to fill the cage with blood and panic in the same instant. Thomas moved toward her, whether to shield her or pull her toward the hatch above, and in that movement he became tangled in her regulator hose and the loose rigging of the cage's interior line. The shark, disoriented by the confined space and the thrashing, released its bite and forced its way back out through the broken gate. It did not return. What killed them after that was not the animal, it was the cage itself. In the chaos, neither diver's air supply was properly seated. Masks knocked loose, hoses kinked in the tangle, and the hatch above, the only way out, required a controlled ascent. Neither of them was in any state to manage. Crew members on deck saw the eruption of movement and blood through the water and began hauling the cage up immediately, but by the time it broke the surface, both Thomas and Julia had drowned inside it. Mexican maritime investigators later documented that the latch mechanism had not been rated for the bait density and shark traffic the operator was drawing to the site, and that the cage's interior rigging, never designed with an emergency breach in mind, had contributed directly to the entanglement that followed. The operator suspended activities during the review. 2 people died, not simply from the animal that made the trip worth taking, but from a gate that gave way at the one moment it couldn't, and a cage that had no plan for what happens after. It was July 3rd, 2017, and the heat in Chiang Mai province had settled past 90 degrees with a humidity that made movement feel deliberate. Heat compounds stress in working animals in ways that do not always show until the threshold has already been crossed. Emily Pierce was 45 years old. She taught middle school history in Portland, Oregon, Oregon and had spent years planning a deliberate trip through Southeast Asia. One of the experiences she had specifically arranged was a guided elephant trek booked through a small local touring operation running daily rides through the surrounding jungle. Emily had done her research on the cultural context of the trip. She had not had access to what the camp's own staff had been observing and documenting for the preceding several days. The bull elephant assigned to the afternoon rides had been displaying indicators of must for the better part of a week. Must does not arrive suddenly, it develops over days in a cascade of measurable changes. Temporal glands on each side of the head swell and discharge fluid down the face. Continuous urinary dribbling stains the insides of the front legs. The animal's behavioral flexibility narrows progressively as testosterone levels climb. These are not subtle signals. They are the kinds of changes that get logged in behavioral records precisely because they change the operational picture around the animal entirely. At this operation, the signs had been recorded. The assessment made by the people responsible for the schedule was that the indicators had not yet reached the threshold that justified pulling the bull from the rotation. That assessment was made by the same people with a financial interest in keeping rides running. I find it genuinely difficult to accept that reasoning. When you have been logging behavioral changes in a 9,000-pound animal for several days and those changes are still accumulating, the correct threshold is not severe enough. It is present and progressing. Those are two very different lines. By the time the afternoon ride reached the midpoint of the hillside trail, the elephant had become increasingly resistant to handler commands. Then, with the sudden and powerful aggression must-affected bulls are specifically known for, he lurched forward along the trail. The howdah shifted violently under that momentum, and Emily was thrown from the platform onto the rocky hillside below. She landed on uneven ground and did not have the seconds required to move. The elephant continued forward in the direction his aggression had already taken him. At 9,000 pounds and moving under full momentum, his front leg came down across Emily's torso before any handler could reach her position. The force was unsurvivable on contact. Internal injuries of that magnitude do not leave a treatment window. There is simply before and after, and the after arrived before anyone on that trail could change it. Guides brought the animal under control through physical redirection applied by multiple handlers working together. By the time emergency responders navigated the remote trail, the window for any intervention had long since closed. Authorities concluded that the elephant's documented behavioral state should have removed him from passenger work before the first ride of the day. The operation suspended elephant riding while veterinary screening procedures were revised. One decision made before Emily Pierce ever arrived at the staging area determined everything that followed. She had no information that would have changed what she chose that morning. The next failure was not made by an operator. It was made by the guest himself in a single movement in front of an animal that processed it in under a second. It was February 18th, 2019, and the morning air in the bushveld carried the dry clarity of a southern African summer flat light. Total visibility, the open landscape looking stable in a way that experienced people in that terrain know to read carefully. Open terrain does not announce its risks. It simply closes the distance. Jake Dalton was 34 years old, a freelance wedding photographer from Denver who had built a secondary practice around wildlife photography during international travel. He understood cameras and framing. He had not spent enough time around large felids to understand what a specific change in his own position would set in motion. The excursion he booked was run by a small, privately operated predator facility, offering supervised walking encounters with lions raised in captivity from cubhood. The entire safety premise of the format depended on one condition remaining intact at every moment: the spatial relationship between the handler, the guest, and the animal. Lions raised in captivity are not domesticated animals. What habituation adjusts is the threshold at which the predatory response activates, and it does not remove that system. Adult lions weigh between 330 and 420 pounds and cover short distances at speeds approaching 35 miles per hour. A lion that detects a guest who has moved ahead of the handler, lowered toward the ground, and become stationary does not evaluate that change through familiarity. It evaluates it through the lens of what its nervous system was built to detect. Jake stepped ahead of the handler and crouched to photograph one of the lions from a lower angle. He wanted a better composition. Moving forward past the handler was the primary factor. The handler's position was the functional reference point the lions had been orienting around throughout the walk. The moment Jake moved past it and lowered himself toward the ground, he removed the spatial structure the encounter depended on entirely. I'll be direct. The handler's position in a walking predator encounter is not scenery. It is the single physical condition on which everything else depends. Moving past it doesn't adjust the encounter. It eliminates it. The lion covered the distance before the handlers could cover theirs. What a lion attack at close range looks like in real time is not what most people picture. It is not a prolonged struggle. It is an animal that weighs over 400 pounds, arriving at full speed and making immediate decisive contact with its full weight behind it. The initial impact drove Jake to the ground. The lion's bite closed across the back of his neck and upper shoulder. The targeting instinct of a large felid at close range is not random. It is directed at the structures that end resistance quickly. Staff deployed noise deterrents and drove vehicles toward the animal within moments. The engagement was brief. The damage it produced was not. Jake had sustained injuries that emergency personnel arriving at the remote facility after the necessary drive could not reverse. Provincial Environmental Affairs authorities reviewed the incident, examining the facility's protocols for supervised guest encounters and handler training standards for close proximity management during guided walks. Jake Dalton had photographed wildlife across multiple continents. In that moment, crouched and forward of the handler, he had not changed his angle. He had changed his status within the only structure keeping the encounter safe. What followed was a different kind of failure. Not in open terrain, but on a river, where no one noticed the boat drifting until it was already too late. It was May 28th, 2015, and the Zambezi River in the late afternoon carried the wide, unhurried pace of the dry season water, brown and opaque. Light coming in low and amber, the air holding the stillness that precedes the abrupt activity of dusk. It is a beautiful time of day on that river. It is also a time of day when territorial animals along the waterline are highly active and the visibility of what lies beneath the surface is effectively zero. Luna Foster was 57 years old. She had worked for 32 years as a registered nurse in Minnesota and had recently retired. The safari she booked was with a small independent guide operation running out of a riverside camp, covering birds, crocodiles, elephants at the water's edge, and hippopotamuses in the shallows. Late in the afternoon, the group's attention fixed on a cluster of fish eagles nesting along the shoreline. While passengers photographed the birds and the guide managed the boat's position, the vessel drifted, gradually. Without anyone registering the direction of the movement, the boat entered a stretch of river a dominant bull hippopotamus had been using as his territory. The hippopotamus is responsible for more human fatalities in Africa than almost any other large land mammal. A dominant bull maintains control of his stretch of water through escalating displays and, when those fail, the full application of an animal that can weigh up to 4,000 pounds. Lower canines can reach 20 inches in length and function as offensive weapons. In the water, they are far more agile than their mass suggests. They do not need to surface to detect an intruder. They can remain submerged for up to 5 minutes, navigating entirely underwater. When they rise beside a boat, no visual warning has been issued beforehand. I've thought about what it actually feels like in that moment, when the full weight of where the boat has drifted lands all at once. There is probably an instant where the information arrives before anything can be done with it. And by that point, the animal has already made its own assessment. The hippopotamus surfaced directly beside the vessel and drove into its hull with the full mass of an animal that in the water has no meaningful friction working against it. The impact was not a glancing blow, it was a direct ram that transferred the animal's full momentum into the side of the boat. The vessel overturned almost instantly. Passengers were thrown into the Zambezi with no warning and no time to establish orientation before hitting the water. Equipment scattered across the surface. The river at that section held both this bull and others nearby, as well as Nile crocodiles active at dusk. The combination of animals in the immediate vicinity of people in the water made coordinated rescue effectively impossible. Luna Foster did not surface after the capsizing. The presence of both hippopotamuses and crocodiles complicated every recovery effort in the minutes that followed, preventing guides from safely reaching the area where she had gone under. Investigators found that the guide had allowed the boat to drift into a section of river his own knowledge of the area should have flagged as high risk, and that his attention had not been consistently on the water and their position while the drift was occurring. The operator revised navigation practices following the incident. Luna Foster had spent 32 years showing up when something went wrong for someone else. 15 minutes of collective attention fixed on birds was the variable that ended the chapter she had just started. The next story involves a drift of a different kind. Not of a boat, but of a morning routine, breaking at exactly the wrong moment in a place designed to feel safer than most. It was October 10th, 2020. and the morning at a small elephant sanctuary in Chiang Mai province carried the soft, overcast quality of a northern Thai autumn, the jungle dense and green just beyond the property's fence line, the grounds already active when the first group arrived. The sanctuary marketed itself on ethical wildlife tourism. Rescued animals, no riding, conservation-focused programming. That language carries real weight with the right kind of traveler. It also requires operational maturity to deliver honestly, and this property had not been operating long enough to have fully built that. Angelo Morales was 49 years old. He worked as an insurance claims manager in Dallas and had taken the trip with a group of coworkers. He had no particular background with wildlife. He was a guest at a property whose on-the-ground management had not kept pace with what its credentials implied. The sanctuary's resident herd had a social structure developed through the time its core animals had spent together. Several weeks before, October 10th, a newly acquired female elephant had been introduced without completing a phased integration. The gradual process through which a new animal observes and approaches the herd incrementally over weeks before any shared space is opened. The introduction had been accelerated partly because the property's enclosure layout did not make extended full separation practical. Her position within the herd's hierarchy had not been established, and the resident dominant animal had not resolved how she intended to manage that uncertainty. Resource competition is where unresolved social tension surfaces most reliably in Asian elephants. Feeding stations had been arranged along a walking trail, with baskets of fruit placed for guest observation. 2 stations had been positioned too close together, a decision made for visitor sightline rather than sound animal management. Both the dominant resident and the newly introduced female were now approaching the same concentrated supply from opposite directions. Asian elephants weigh between 6,000 and 11,000 pounds. Their shoulder width can exceed 6 feet. When 2 animals of that scale enter active competition in a confined trail space, the footprint of that confrontation is not small, and its trajectory is not predictable. Guides recognized what was developing and directed visitors to move back immediately. Angelo stepped sideways off the ledge of the trail to retrieve a camera he had set down moments earlier. Just a few feet. It placed him in the gap between the trail and the feeding area at the exact moment the dominant elephant charged toward the other animal. Neither elephant was moving toward Angelo. That is what makes this sequence so structurally unsparing to reconstruct. The dominant elephant's charge and the retreating animal's collision path converged across a section of trail only a few feet wide, the same section Angelo occupied while bending for his camera. He was caught between 2 animals in active lateral collision, each carrying several tons of momentum in opposing directions. The compressive force between them at the moment of impact was not survivable. It was not a trampling. It was not a directed attack. It was 2 immovable masses meeting across the precise space a person happened to occupy, and the physics of that contact left nothing to treat. Handlers worked to separate the animals using commands and deterrent equipment, a process that, once 2 large elephants are in active conflict, takes considerably more time than the chaos suggests it will. The sanctuary suspended public walking tours while feeding arrangements, guest positioning, and integration procedures for newly introduced animals were redesigned from the ground up. Angelo Morales died a few feet from a trail he had been standing on safely moments before. The sanctuary had constructed something that looked right. The parts of it that weren't right were exactly where the morning went. The next story left dry ground, entirely shallow water, a breeding season, and a week's worth of visible warning that nobody acted on. It was August 18th, 2018, and the Pacific coast of Baja California was warm and flat, the kind of morning that makes an enclosed, shallow water facility look like exactly the controlled environment it is presented as. A supervised sea lion encounter program had been running there for several seasons with no serious incident, which is usually the condition under which things that require consistent attention start receiving less of it. Nina Kim was 38 years old. She was a certified public accountant from Seattle who took one meaningful trip each year, typically to coastal destinations, and maintained a long-standing interest in marine wildlife. In the days preceding August 18th, the adult male California sea lion housed in the encounter enclosure had been markedly more reactive than his baseline behavior warranted. The facility had entered breeding season. For an adult bull California sea lion, this is a documented, annually recurring neurological shift driven by reproductive competition in which territorial maintenance becomes the animal's dominant mode. The bull had been vocalizing excessively, posturing toward trainers during routine maintenance, and had required active redirection on multiple occasions during the preceding week. These were not subtle signals. They were the behavioral indicators that anyone managing a large male in breeding condition should recognize immediately as a direct flag for the type of in-water encounters this facility was continuing to run. The encounters continued regardless. I'll say what I think about that plainly. You have an animal communicating with every behavioral tool its biology provides that it is not suited to casual visitor proximity in an enclosed space. The decision to keep running encounters is not ambiguous. It is a choice made in direct view of visible evidence. And the direction of that choice was wrong. During the group photo session, another guest accidentally dropped a full bucket of fish into the shallow water. Multiple sea lions surged toward the platform as the food dispersed. Trainers redirected their attention and instructed guests to hold their positions. Nina stepped backward to create space for the trainers working beside her. The section of shallow water she stepped into was within the boundary the bull was actively maintaining. The male lunged from the water onto the platform edge and drove Nina sideways into the enclosure. He bit into her upper arm on initial contact. Not a warning bite, a full committed bite that tore through muscle and into the tissue beneath it. As Nina tried to push back toward the platform, he followed, biting again across her shoulder and then across the left side of her torso. Each bite placed with the speed of an animal that in the water moves faster than it looks possible. Adult male California sea lions reach 600 to 700 pounds and deliver bite force capable of producing deep lacerations and crush injury to bone. The bites across her shoulder and torso opened major blood vessels. Each attempt she made to reach the platform registered as continued intrusion and drew another response. Trainers used deterrent poles and direct physical intervention to drive the animal back. It required multiple handlers and sustained effort before the bull disengaged. By the time Nina was clear of the water, she had sustained lacerations across multiple areas of her body and was hemorrhaging at a rate that field response could not adequately control. Emergency responders reached the facility, but the blood loss had progressed past the threshold at which their arrival changed anything. Wildlife officials concluded the adult male had responded to a territorial intrusion fully consistent with the behavioral state of a bull in breeding season. That is accurate. And it is also a direct acknowledgement that the conditions making that response possible had been visible for an entire week and had not produced any change in how the facility was operating. The operation permanently ended in-water encounters involving adult male sea lions. Nina Kim's death was not caused by an animal behaving unusually. It was caused by an animal behaving exactly as breeding bulls behave, with a week of clear behavioral warnings set aside and a guest placed in the enclosure anyway. Every other story in this collection unfolded in remote terrain or on open water. The last one happened inside a public attraction on an ordinary weekday with staff nearby and still required only one deferred repair and one unmonitored moment. It was March 22nd, 2022, and the morning at a small wildlife park in regional Queensland was dry and warm. The park was not one of the large accredited facilities. Queensland's tourism infrastructure is built around it was a smaller, independently operated attraction running on a modest staff. It had operated for years without a serious incident, which is the condition under which maintenance items quietly accumulate without urgency. James Reed was 61 years old. He was a retired diesel mechanic from Brisbane who had spent much of his retirement visiting wildlife parks across Queensland. He had been to enough of these places that the format was thoroughly familiar. Follow the paths, stay behind the barriers, watch the demonstrations, move on. Familiarity with a format has a way of flattening the significance of its individual elements, including the elements that are structural rather than decorative. The crocodile feeding demonstration had concluded. The saltwater crocodile enclosure was an outdoor exhibit with a natural earth and rock perimeter, a deep water section, and a dry bank where the animals basked. The public viewing area ran along the outer boundary, separated by a barrier rail. Further along the perimeter, a section of chain link fencing marked the edge of the maintained visitor area. Beyond it, the outer fence line continued older in construction, maintained less frequently, and noted in a park maintenance log several months prior as requiring repair. That repair had not been completed. After the demonstration, guests clustered along the main barrier photographing the animals. James moved along the viewing area looking for a clearer sight line and reached the section of outer chain link where a widened gap, the result of the unaddressed fence repair, allowed a person to step through onto a narrow, earthen path running between the outer boundary and the enclosure's water edge. Staff were positioned at the other end of the exhibit. The section of perimeter James had entered was not under active monitoring. Saltwater crocodiles are the largest living reptile species on Earth. Large adult males can reach 17 feet in length and exceed 1,000 pounds. What defines them in any proximity assessment is the ambush response, a reflex requiring no prior provocation, no territorial claim, and no hunger cue to activate. A saltwater crocodile at the water's edge responds to close-range movement with a strike that initiates from complete stillness and arrives before the target has registered that movement has begun. There is no warning. The interval between initiation and contact is not a human-scale unit of time. The earthen path James had entered ran directly alongside the enclosure's water margin. The ground was uneven mud and organic material accumulated along the base of the enclosure wall over time. It was not a maintained surface. James slipped. He fell directly into the enclosure. When I think about this one against everything else in this collection, it sits differently. He was not inside an encounter format. He was not handling an animal. He stepped through a gap in a fence that had been sitting in a maintenance log for months and had started to look like a feature of the landscape rather than a failure of it. That specific kind of risk, the slow disappearance of a boundary that was supposed to be there, is one of the harder ones to account for, because it does not look like danger until someone is already inside it. The crocodile was in the water when James fell. It reached him within seconds. A saltwater crocodile does not approach cautiously. It moves at speed from the moment it has registered the target, and the first contact is not exploratory. The animal bit across James's lower body and immediately executed the death roll that saltwater crocodiles use to subdue and disorient prey, a rapid, full-body rotation that generates torsional force far beyond what human musculature can resist, and that in shallow water offers the person being rolled no stable surface to push against. A staff member near the outer boundary noticed movement and moved toward the area. By the time they arrived at the gap, James was already in the water. Armed response personnel were called and deployed. James was recovered, but he had sustained injuries that emergency services could not address. The investigation identified multiple compounding failures. The compromised fencing had been flagged in maintenance documentation months prior and not repaired. The outer perimeter was not under active monitoring during the post-demonstration period, and the park's physical separation between the visitor boundary and the enclosure edge depended on a single fence line with a documented and unresolved structural failure. The park undertook a comprehensive review of outer perimeter fencing, monitoring coverage during public programming, and maintenance response timelines for all flagged safety items. James Reed crossed a boundary looking for a better view, the same impulse that had taken him to parks across Queensland for years without consequence. The gap in the fence had been there long enough to stop looking like a problem. The enclosure behind it had no interest in that distinction. Saltwater crocodiles do not evaluate the intent of the person who has entered their water. They evaluate the presence. Everything after that, it's biology.